We are absolutely honoured to have the Honourable Stephen Crawford, Associate Minister of Mines for the Government of Ontario, with us. And I'm also glad to be able to bring up my good friend Baroness Lindsay Northover, who's co-chair of the APPG on critical minerals, who will be interviewing or having a fireside chat with the Minister. Thank you.
We have lots of chairs to choose between, don't we?
For sure, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for that introduction, and thank you very much, Stephen, for coming along and joining us today. And I think that this discussion actually follows on very well from what we've been talking about earlier, given Canada's history in mining, and also, as we talked about earlier, the social buy-in that happens in Canada, which isn't necessarily reflected in the United Kingdom and Europe and elsewhere. Just to introduce you first, you were first elected, I gather, in 2018, and were re-elected in 2022. As you will all know, Canada does have a thriving mining area industry, and that includes Ontario as well, of course, and that's been expanding, I gather. That's been growing. And so therefore the Premier, Doug Ford, appointed you to this new position, which in itself is very interesting, as the Minister of Mines, Associate Minister of Mines. And your appointment was made just this year in June. Yep. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what your role is as in this new position.
Yeah, thank you, Baroness. Great to be here in the UK. Again, and I was appointed in June of this year. My background, Baroness, is more in the financial industry. I worked 20 years in the investment industry in Toronto. So I have a pretty strong background in the financial area, and one of the areas that our government is focused on, obviously, is mining and critical minerals, and we'll touch on that, I'm sure, later in the chat. But one of the subcomponents of mining is obviously capital formation, and I know the previous speakers did very briefly touch on that. So I have a particular emphasis where I'll be focusing on capital formation. Toronto is still the global leader in mining finance, and certainly one of my objectives will be not only speeding up the mining process in Ontario, but also capital formation, because mining is very capital intensive. So one of our focuses is focused very much on attracting capital, but making sure, just as importantly, that we have fair capital markets. So that's one of the areas I'm looking at. We believe in some cases there may be foreign actors that are intentionally, in some cases, suppressing certain companies in the capital markets, and that's a concern to us. So that's something we're reviewing right now.
Well, that's very, very interesting. And following on from the last discussion, the need for capital and the difficulty in mining to access that makes this incredibly important. So in terms of the renewables, I wondered what investments have been made by the province in terms of electric vehicles and battery manufacturing, and what that might mean for the mining sector in Ontario. Yeah,
that's very true. So just for those of you that don't know, Ontario, since we've been elected in 2018, has attracted approximately 45 billion Canadian dollars in electric vehicle manufacturing plants, businesses in the province. So by comparison, the entire United States has about 118 billion. So just Ontario, as one component of Canada, has led the way as the #1 destination in North America for electric vehicle manufacturing. So we're bringing a lot of investments from all over the world to Ontario in the south. And a lot of the reason that companies are attracted to Ontario include, obviously, the critical minerals we have. So we have the critical minerals that are required for electric vehicles in Northern Ontario, which we are obviously mining right now, but have big plans to mine substantially higher amounts over the next 2 decades. And we have the manufacturing in the south. So we have companies like Stellantis. Actually, in my home riding, I'm just outside of Toronto. Ford Canada's assembly complex is right in my community. They were expected to shut that facility just a few years ago. And they have now announced that they will be continuing to produce vehicles there, including electric vehicles eventually. But the demand is so great such that they will be staying in Ontario, fortunately. We have an abundance of, I would say, fairly cost-efficient and very clean energy. And one of the reasons that Stellantis and Volkswagen, which is, I believe, is going to build one of the largest production facilities in the entire world, just outside of the other London, in London, Ontario, is the fact that we have a very clean grid. So 87% of Ontario's energy is clean. That is among the highest, not only in North America, but among the world. So a lot of that is hydro, nuclear, some renewables as well. So we have a very clean grid. They're attracted to the clean grid, especially with the ESG interest today. So Ontario has been a magnet for that. We have an abundance of skilled labor. Obviously, we have land, we have minerals. So we have a lot of what a lot of foreign companies are looking for. And of course, access to and proximity to the US market. And of course, we have, as you may have heard here in the UK, there's been some talk in the last few days from President-elect Trump vis-a-vis tariffs on Canada. I'm happy to touch on that if you like as well.
I was wondering about that because, as you say, that US major market must be very significant for Canadian business. And there is indeed talk of tariffs.
Yeah, we had that in the first administration, and we worked out a new trade deal between Canada, Mexico, and US. So I'll start by saying I'm not overly concerned about it. The trade between Canada and the US is just under $1 trillion. It's one of the biggest bilateral relationships in the world. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the magnitude of something like that, if a 25% tariff was put on all trade, would be enormous. However, I'm not particularly concerned. I know our Premier, Doug Ford, has been leading the charge, talking to our Prime Minister and some of the US officials, and the Prime Minister was down there a few days ago to meet President-elect Trump. I'm not overly concerned. And as well, we also, I might add, the vehicles that are manufactured in North America, some of the parts go back and forth on the border about 7 times before they're actually put together. So it's really an impracticality. Secondly, the critical minerals we have in Ontario are absolutely essential for US electric vehicles, but also US defense purposes. So, we've been down to Washington a number of times meeting top US officials, and I can tell you the one issue that either US administration, depending on who won the election, where there was some uniformity in terms of consensus, was on the critical minerals, and most of which come from Ontario and Canada. So the fact that we have the resources the US needs puts us in a pretty good spot. So having said that, listen, it is a concern, and we've relayed the concerns vis-a-vis the border with the federal government. There has been some concerns from the US administration about fentanyl and some illegal migrants. I think the numbers they went from like 2,000 at the Canadian-US border 2 or 3 years ago to 20,000. So it is significant, and we are concerned about it as a provincial government. We need the federal government to act on that. But comparison to Mexico, it's about 1.5 million a year. So it is a concern, and I get the US concern vis-a-vis the Canadian-US border. However, it's very minuscule compared to what's between the US-Mexican border. But having said that, again, we need to relay our concerns to our federal government, which we have done.
And it is said, isn't it, that Trump this time is surrounded by quite a number of billionaires and business people, whereas last time it was quite a lot of right-wingers who mightn't have had those particular interests. So no doubt you're getting the message that you need across to those people around Trump who would see their own business interests affected by what might happen.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, obviously Elon Musk is the new BFF with the president-elect, but he obviously owns Tesla. Tesla doesn't have any facility per se in Canada, but they're all over the US, and there's a lot of electric vehicle manufacturers that are being built in Canada as well. And one difference we had with a previous government in Ontario, they really, quite frankly, almost gave up on manufacturing.
Right.
We have seen a renaissance in manufacturing in Ontario we have never witnessed anywhere in the world. Ontario is now the 3rd largest mining or manufacturing jurisdiction in North America, after California and Texas. We have had more people migrate to Ontario in the last couple of years than have gone to Texas and Florida combined. And that's with a smaller population base. So there is an interest, there's a manufacturing renaissance, and very much a mining renaissance happening in Ontario today. We've had this year alone, actually, 2 new gold mines come online. And there's 4 major projects in Ontario that are underway in terms of major expansion. And we've got a lot of potential mineral deposits, including potentially the largest nickel deposit in the world in Timmins, Ontario, that could be brought online within a few years. So we have the commodities that the US in particular, but the Western world is in very, very dire need of. And we see what's happening abroad. I think the previous speakers did touch on what's happening with China. China is definitely a threat. And Ontario is a place where we can get a lot of those rare earths, minerals that other Western nations don't have in abundance. And again, it's a proximity to the US that makes it very attractive as well.
Yes, and of course, hence the strategic partnership, and the United Kingdom certainly recognising the significance of Canada in that regard.
Yeah.
So you've said a little bit about renewable energy that you've got in Canada, which is absolutely excellent. But I wondered if you could tell me a bit more about how government and industry is working to collaborate to decarbonise economies generally around the world, and what role your province is playing in this particular transition.
Yeah.
And also, if I can add on to it, in terms of ESG, that was again a theme that ran through the last session, and it is quite striking, as you will know, in terms of the social buy-in to allow mining, how strong it appears to be in Canada, and how problematic it is across the EU and in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We were at the mining exposition in Las Vegas just a few months ago, which is the world's largest mining exposition. And there was representatives from Germany there, and they mentioned to us, I can't believe how much you talk about mining and there's a buy-in. Like, we don't even, it's a dirty word in Germany. And nothing could be further from the truth. If you have an electric vehicle, if you have a cell phone, which I'm sure everybody in this audience does, you need mining. So this doesn't magically appear, these metals and minerals. So in Ontario, we've worked very collaboratively as a government to set the stage for this buy-in, as you call it, social buy-in with business, with northern and indigenous communities, with the private sector. We work collaboratively with that to make sure there is a buy-in. And most of our mining, the overwhelming majority of it, is in northern Ontario, where 90% of our land is and 10% of our population. And down where we are in southern Ontario, of course, it's reverse. We have a lot of buy-in from indigenous communities. A lot of these mining areas are in areas where there are traditional territories of various indigenous communities. And oftentimes, the companies will sit down, and government will certainly provide a framework to be able to sit down and work out. And these indigenous communities, more often than not, and this, you may not hear this in the media because you might hear about 1 or 2 groups that are very opposed to mining, but the majority work very well. And that's the ticket to prosperity for Northern Ontario and for indigenous communities, is to have mining. So there's resource sharing, royalty sharing, and that's bringing prosperity and to many of these communities in the north. So that's very important. So working with the communities, also developing a skilled workforce. Our government's been very focused on skilled trades in general, but in particular to mining. We have some of the best educational institutions in the world in Ontario and throughout Canada. So we try to train the next generation, but also very focused on skills development, working with private sector. We recently announced with Agnico Eagle a skills development fund for $10 million. We work with indigenous communities. I might add that the mining sector is has the highest ratio of indigenous workforce in the province of Ontario. It's about 9% of the mining sector is actually indigenous community members. So we want them to be involved where they can in that and train them And, you know,
And with
we're excited. We're excited.
Yes. And with the indigenous communities, are you working with women as well as men? That could be a challenge, I know, from development studies.
The Government of Ontario has put out some ads recently and encouraging both Aboriginal and female participation in the workforce. It's traditionally not been the case, but we encourage everyone to take part in that.
Yes, well, that's good to hear. And so, because this audience is probably very interested in what opportunities there might be, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the opportunities for engagement from overseas in terms of mining in Ontario.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Ontario is an attractive place to work, live, raise a family, but also to invest. So we do have a lot of foreign companies that are involved in Ontario. Of course, one of the largest nickel mines in the world is in Sudbury, Ontario, actually my father's hometown, up in northern Ontario, Vale being the major investor there. So we have Brazilian, Australian companies. Glencore is up in Timmins, Ontario, and there's a lot of smaller companies involved as well. But I expect there will be a lot more foreign investment in the mining sector in Ontario, and we welcome that.
And in terms of government support for the mining sector, again, that's a theme that's been running through as to how substantial that is, given the long-term nature of mining and the need for that financial support. What kind of support is the Government of Ontario giving?
Yes, we as a government, I mean, I think first and foremost is setting the table for attracting people to want to actually work and live here, and you know, we also have a shortage of doctors in northern communities, so we've had learn and stay programs to attract medical peoples, because people that are coming from southern Ontario or other parts of the world, if they're moving into the mining sector in Ontario, they need to have health facilities, they need to have educational facilities, so setting that is important. But as a government, we've also, aside from the skills development, we've also set up some programs to help junior mining companies, the Ontario Junior Exploration Program, where we are supporting junior companies. So these are very smaller companies. This is not the major players, but who typically are the ones that are out drilling and exploring. So we've set up a program from that. We've also set up a critical minerals fund to help companies that are involved throughout the supply chain of critical minerals beyond exploration, but also development of those minerals throughout Ontario. And we've had also set up an Aboriginal participation fund where we help indigenous communities and help them go through the mining, permitting, processing, and negotiating with some companies to set up some deals with them. So the government is very supportive of this, and that's, I think, partially why we're seeing this renewed interest in mining. But I can tell you the next 2 decades are going to be particularly exciting.
Well, that's good to hear, and actually a very, very good note to end on. So thank you very, very much indeed. Will you be here for the rest of the day, or at least over lunch?
Yes, we will be here for lunch, and we'll also be going to the other conferences that are in London as well.
Yes.
So we look forward to meeting everyone individually as well.
So thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to engagement of the audience with you later on. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.